if you look at it, Xinjiang is very important for China. It's very different from all the other provinces. First of all, it's the biggest province of all Chinese provinces. And then, of course, it has the longest land borders compared to any other province. And also it borders with, I think, 8 or 9 countries. There is no other Chinese province that borders on so many countries. So this in itself is a source of sensitivity to Chinese. And then in addition, of course, there is the problem of the nationalities in Xinjiang. Still, I mean, the Chinese are a minority. They are now about 42%, 43%, which is about 10 times they used to be in 1949 when they occupied Xinjiang. But still, I mean, minority nationalities, most of them Muslim, are still a majority of the province, of the autonomous region. And more specifically, while some of the minorities have already homeland just outside China, like the Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and so on, and the Uzbek, of course, they have Uzbekistan. Uyghurs do not have a homeland, and this is a source of, from Chinese point of view, of instability. In addition to that, of course, Xinjiang is the location of China's nuclear, used to be the location of China's nuclear tests, and it's still, you know, China's missiles firing range, intermediate range ballistic missile, and even ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles, which makes the Chinese very sensitive about the region. And then we have to mention the issue of energy. China's main sources of energy are still in the northeast or eastern China, you know, in Shandong or in the Dongbei, in Manchuria. But gradually, the center is moving. The center of China's energy industry is moving westward towards Xinjiang. And within a few years, Xinjiang is going to be China's main oil base and gas base. And in addition to that, Xinjiang has already become a junction for supplying oil from other countries. So the pipeline from Kazakhstan is going to Xinjiang and then, of course, to China. And in the future, I believe that there will be some pipelines from Western Siberia into Xinjiang, and maybe even from Pakistan, from the port of Gwadar, into China. So Xinjiang is becoming quite important for China. The question is what the Chinese are doing about it. They don't do much about it. They don't have such huge military concentrations because this is a huge country. They can control the country very easily. Population is relatively small, certainly small compared to the size of this province. I think there are now about 20 million, more or less, 18 or 20 million in Xinjiang, which is one of the smallest Chinese provinces. So it is important, but it is not that important as people believe to be. People used to speak about, especially Uyghurs used to speak about 1 million troops in Xinjiang. And this, of course, doesn't make sense. If the entire Chinese army is now about 2.5 million, there is no point in stationing 1 million of them in Xinjiang. And those who know a little bit Chinese history also understand that also in the past, most of the Chinese troops were located around the capitals and not in the faraway, provinces. So I think that the number of troops is much smaller, and certainly the quality is lower. And I think the Chinese don't have more than, I don't know, 60, 70,000 soldiers in, PLA, People's Liberation Army soldiers in Xinjiang. And these are also maybe 4 divisions and of second-rate quality. But in addition to the military, they have People's Armed Police, and they have the militia, and they have the Bingtuan, which is the production construction corps in Xinjiang, which take care of domestic security. They're not trained to meet external challenges, and there are no external challenges right now, not from India, certainly not from Russia. So I think the Chinese can control this province with a smaller number of troops than people usually imagine. The big change occurred in the early 1990s when after the reform and opening up of China, and the collapse and disintegration of the Soviet Union, and the opening of the borders between China and Central Asia, and the free movement of people, merchandise across the border, and also there was an influx of ideas, of literature, maybe of smuggled weapons and so on into Xinjiang for a while. So I think that if we look at the 1990s, by the end of the 1990s, I think Chinese managed to control the situation more or less, and to get rid of all these kind of influencers. I mean, the border stations are heavily guarded now, and so I don't think there is infiltration of, let's say, foreign agents, as the Chinese used to say, who somehow promoted terrorism inside Xinjiang. So it is funny that after September 11, the threat in Xinjiang has become much smaller than it used to be before, because of all these measures the Chinese had undertaken. And but what China was trying was to use, of course, the situation of the battle against terrorism and the alliance with the United States against terrorism to crack down on Uyghurs, on the so-called separatist movement in Xinjiang. And the fact is, even by Chinese data, there is no information of any upsurge of terrorist violence in Xinjiang. And sometimes, at least I get the impression that Chinese inflate this threat where it doesn't really exist, in order to crack down and suppress Uyghurs in Xinjiang. One part of the problem, of course, none of these were verified. Even later incidents during the Olympic Games and so on, there is no. The Chinese have never provided real evidence for these incidents, and we don't know about them. But even if we take the Chinese reports, you can see that by the end of around 1998, most of these violence, so to speak, stopped, and the Chinese could not report any new kind of incidents, except on a very sporadic basis. And I'm not sure that these are really terrorist violence or just kind of criminal acts or social disturbances or something that have nothing to do with, let's say, with the promotion of separatism, of independence, or something like that. This organization, the ETIM, I have doubts if it exists at all. And if it does, I mean, maybe very few people, it is not active inside China. But it's easy for the Chinese, to use this kind of an organization, maybe because of Washington's approval, as a target, and as a means to suppress further Uyghurs. But I have my doubts about this organization. My feeling is that the threat is being inflated beyond all proportions. And also, if you think, first of all, you have to understand the kind of Islam in Central Asia and in Xinjiang. It's basically it's Sunni Islam, and it's a quite moderate Islam, and it's eclectic because it includes all kinds of elements from local cultures, you know, even from Buddhism and so on, and it's never been kind of fanatic or fundamentalist Islam that we know from other countries, let's say from Iran maybe, or some other country, even Pakistan. These government regimes have a very long tradition, Soviet traditions, of controlling population. They have all the means to do it. So I don't see any kind of threat, certainly significant threat to their governments or to China from these kind of, so to speak, Islamic militant group. There are some militant groups, but really they are a minority. They cannot change the situation very much. So I think they are all in agreement somehow, and it's a kind of a game, you know, of showing that we are in control. We will not allow things like you know, kind of terrorism and so on to happen. Chinese do not react to actual situation. They react to potential situation. I mean, if you see, you can look at let's say the Tiananmen event in 1989 and so on. Was it necessary to use the army? You know, a certain number of divisions to suppress the people and kill, I don't know, hundreds. Some people say thousands. It was not. And also, I mean, in Xinjiang, there is no real problem right now. I mean, the region is quiet basically. And when I visited Xinjiang several times until 2002, and I couldn't see, you know, soldiers and so on, or any kind of disturbances, except for some, you know, little incidents. So there is no reason for that. And then the question is why the Chinese continue to suppress Uyghurs in many ways, in not allowing, you know, teaching in Uyghurs in schools, and by sending young Uyghurs to other universities in China, far away from home. You know, I met, when I was in Xiamen, I met some Uyghur students in Xiamen in the south of China. So why do they do that? And why they continue to suppress the Uyghurs? And the reason is because Chinese are not concerned about the situation today. They are concerned about the situation in the future. If they do not act today, what will happen in the future? So there is no proportion between Chinese use, let's say, use of force or violence against Uyghurs now, but there is a proportion in Chinese imagination in case they don't do it. They'll have to do it in the future. So this is why it's done. And it's true that many, that people in Xinjiang are very afraid to talk to foreigners, even to academics, and academics who come to Xinjiang are being watched, are being followed, and the people that they meet are then later on being interrogated by the police and so on, and they are warned not to keep in touch and so on. So there are all kinds of measures the Chinese use against foreigners, you know, doing research or trying to understand the real situation in Xinjiang. This is a precedent as far as China is concerned, because China never, in the past, has never initiated any kind of regional organization. So this is the first. And I think Chinese wanted to use the opportunity after the collapse of the Soviet Union and to try and gain a foothold in Central Asia by organizing the different countries, of course, together with Russia, not against Russia, together with Russia, but to facilitate, you know, China's re-entry, so to speak, into Central Asia. And you know, officially, of course, this organization is directed against the so-called three evils, which are terrorism, religious extremism, and separatism, and also against, implicitly, against hegemonism, that's against the United States. So this was the main reason. It was not so much security, because, first of all, there is no symmetry between the partners to this organization. I mean, Russia and China are a very big country, and then the other one, I mean, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan that joined later are much, you know, smaller. And of course, there is no question that Kazakhstan somehow threatened China or Russia. So I don't think it was really security, but these are main reasons. I mean, mostly we can call it domestic security. Domestic security. And it's funny because at that time when this organization was established, it did not deal with economic issues, let's say with energy. Energy was not on the agenda when this organization was first established in 1996. But later, well, now it's becoming much more important because it's so important for China, especially for China, and because China wants to get some of its energy from Central Asia. But so far, I think, if I recall, it's no more than maybe 3% of its energy import comes from Central Asia, specifically from Kazakhstan. The Chinese were trying to influence the leaders of Central Asia, that they all share the same kind of threats from Islamic radicalism and from separatism and terrorism, and where Chinese don't distinguish between all the three. So there is a connection between all. I mean, the terrorists are also Islamic radicalists and they're also separatists, and they are trying to convince the leaders of Central Asia that they are facing the same kind of threats, and to encourage them to take action against Uyghurs or maybe some other other organizations. From today's perspective, the success was quite I would say limited. It is true that some Uyghurs were extradited from Central Asia to China and stood trial, and some of them were executed, and so on. But Uyghur organizations and communities in Central Asia continue to be active. There are schools, there are theaters, they have cultural life, and so on. Maybe they are less influential than they used to be in the past, but they continue to exist. So even the Central Asian leaders understand they cannot submit to Chinese pressure all the way, but they can do it some of the way. It's very interesting because in the past the Chinese always thought about the Uyghur issues, Uyghur issue as a domestic, China's domestic affair, in which other countries or governments are not allowed to interfere. And this is a principle Chinese apply also in its own behavior towards other countries. So I would say until the early 1990s, the Chinese were not very much concerned about these international Uyghur associations, organizations, and their influence and so on. But from the early 1990s on, the Chinese realized that, especially after the opening up of China, that the international community shows much more interest in Xinjiang and in the Uyghurs. It goes hand in hand with the U.S. policy of promoting democracy and concern about human rights abuses and so on. And suddenly the Chinese realized that these Uyghur associations outside China have gained some influence within foreign parliaments and governments and NGOs and United Nations and so on. And this is when the Chinese began to apply pressure on other governments, certainly in Central Asia, but also in Turkey especially, but also in other governments, to check the activities of the political nationalist activities of the Uyghurs. So Chinese are concerned about it. Certainly now, because one of the main means of communication is through the internet, and it's very difficult to block. Although Chinese are trying to block websites and so on, there are still all kinds of connections between outside communities and China. And I don't think that there is a lot of influence from outside, especially since most of the population in Xinjiang, most of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang are still peasants. They don't have access to the internet, and if at all they have some influence on the intellectual strata of the Uyghur community in Xinjiang. I don't see any big change in the near future, or even in the far away from now, because China is becoming very, very strong, and because people are, I mean, governments are very concerned not to irritate the Chinese too much, and I think time is on China's side, and I don't think there's going to be any significant change. Unless, of course, there will be some kind of some upheavals inside China, which would lead to China some kind of disintegration from inside, some kind of unrest, social unrest, maybe as a result of the economic crisis. Although I think Chinese are very much in control. Or the other possibility is, of course, some kind of international confrontation, maybe over Taiwan, that would allow Uyghurs in Xinjiang and Tibetans and maybe also Mongols to regain their independence. Point is, I can see that either. I don't see that this is coming in the near future. On the contrary, it's going to be much more complicated now to face China, and therefore I don't see any significant change for some time.